Welcome to the HIP Leadership Conference 2022. This afternoon, we present a fireside chat and armchair conversation with Pia Infante and John Palfrey. And now, please welcome the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, Pia Infante, and the president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, John Palfrey.
Supposed to start. Hi everyone, can you hear me? Wow, you can really hear me. Okay, I won't yell. Good afternoon. I know it's post-lunch siesta time, so I really appreciate that you are here and willing to listen. So John and I understand this is an armchair conversation with no fire, but we've decided, because I used to teach 5th grade and it's very hard for me to do public speaking sitting down, we're just gonna start standing up if that's okay with you. Just because we need our energy. So I'm gonna say a little introduction of myself and let John introduce himself. So I am Pia Infante of the Whitman Institute, but as you may know, we actually spent out the endowment. So I no longer am the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, and part of, I think, what I wanna talk about is something that the first panel of presidents told us, which is the level of action required to get the resources in motion. And for me, spend out is one of those things. But we just spent out our endowment. I am now a fellow with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I also am Filipina, an immigrant, I'm queer, and I think I've had most of my experiences not being mainstream or not looking like the way leadership is sort of typically described in this country. So I am just as surprised as you are that you have heard of trust-based philanthropy. Really. Shocking to me that there's this phrase that sort of came out of the milieu of our work that now people all over the sector are talking about. So I'm going to get into that, but it is a different place for me to be associated with trust-based philanthropy, which is, I think, now sort of being held as best practice or something like that. And I want to look at that a little bit in this conversation as well as the following panel. So John, thank you for joining us from Chicago. I wondered if you could share something about yourself that people might not know about you from the interwebs.
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I am so delighted to be here at HIP with all of you, and particularly the Chicago team that's here. And if you're, look at that. MacArthur is well represented, but so is Woods Fund and all sorts of great partners here. And if you are tuning in virtually, it's great that you are here too, but you are missing out in Miami. So one thing I will say is I've been on the board of Knight Foundation now for about 12 years, and I think Raul may be here and Alberto later. I've loved coming to Miami 4 times a year, more or less, for that period of time. It's just such a treat. And the thing that is not on the internet is that my family has never come with me, which I feel terrible about, but just for whatever reason they never have. So the fact, Pia, that you may have some family members here with you, this trip, you've already done better than I've done in about a dozen years. So
your secret life in Miami, is that what you were?
You know, it's so interesting, I didn't think of it that way. I didn't, but it could be, I guess.
See, exposés, here, sit with us.
That is not on the internet, yeah.
I'm just kidding. Yes, yeah, it really is a pleasure to be chatting with you, John, and we have a mere few minutes to have this conversation. So I want to get right into it, which is, I believe that I wanted to clarify that trust-based philanthropy started because when we decided to spend out our endowment, we went directly to our grantees and social movement partners, and we asked them, what do you want us to do in our final 10 years? Because we are accountable to you, not, as Michelle said, to our bank account, but we are accountable to our communities, and we asked them what they wanted us to do. And they said, we want you to influence your peers, because apparently funders only listen to funders. You know, Hewlett actually put out the study peer-to-peer, and many of us admitted that we only listened to our peers. So our grantees said, if you could convince your peers to fund in the way that you fund, which for us was always in the spirit of service, in deep accountability and relationship with the communities that we serve, and wasn't just about grant making, it was about the culture of our organization, how we operated as a team at the staff and board level, the kinds of relationships we had internally, and the kinds of relationships we had in our partnerships. And they gave us the phrase trust-based philanthropy. So the first thing I want to say is trust-based philanthropy didn't come from a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign or from Bridgespan. It came directly from social movement leaders and community leaders.
Are those one and the same sometimes?
Not always. But big consulting firms. That's not where trust-based philanthropy came from. And I think it's often over-associated with some of the grant-making practices, all of which are great. Core funding, long-term support, not belaboring our visionary leaders. But I think it's easy as funders to talk about just grant-making, and I think it's harder to talk about the kinds of structural and cultural change we actually need in our institutions in the field. So that is the one thing I wanted to lead with, which is the way that I understand trust-based philanthropy is it is actually a systems approach to culture and structural change. And it sort of starts with the place that most funders are willing to talk about, which is grant making. We're not always willing to talk about what the endowment dollars are doing. We're not always willing to talk about what it's like to work for us. Like when we were chatting backstage, and we both are neither extroverts or introverts, we're kind of EI people. But when I really want to understand how somebody leads, I'll ask the person who works most closely with them. And one of the things about trust-based philanthropy, where I come from with it, is there are so many institutions that have incredible missions and visions on the doorways, and then the actual experience of being in relationship with them is withering and sometimes humiliating for their staff and their grantees. And so that to me is what I mean about culture, leadership, and structure, in addition to the grant-making practices. So I wanted to just take a moment to do that, because we're going to spend the next panel also talking a little bit about trust-based philanthropy. But for you, I mean, John, we come from such hugely different institutions. I spent out an endowment, which was a private endowment, which was probably nowhere near the size ever of MacArthur. And so I know how it looks in my context. I'm wondering if you could describe what does trust-based philanthropy look like in the context of the multi-billion-dollar endowment that you steward?
Wow, Pierre, well, you have said so much already, so there's a whole lot of dittoing that I would do based on what you said. The idea that people who would work with us would feel humiliated or withered by working with us, what a terrible idea, and I certainly hope our staff do not feel that way, although I'm sure there are days on which it's not life is not utopia in any workplace, but certainly what you've described squares with what I hope for MacArthur and for what our relationship with grantees, as well as our staff and community members. I would also say having, and this is not just pandering to the crowd from Chicago, but I do think that in the context of Chicago leading philanthropic organizations, whether that's Woods, whether that's Living Cities, whether that's Healthy Communities, the Trust, other organizations, we have, I think, some really great exemplars of probably versions of trust-based philanthropy that you would recognize. And if Michelle Morales and what she does at Woods, I think, is probably as close as I can think of a living example that I know really well, doing it really well. And so, at MacArthur, we absolutely have a portfolio of different things that we do. We don't do one form of grant making, and those who work in grants management have to be really versatile because we do so many different things. The thing we're most famous for that we've done for more than 40 years is the MacArthur Fellows Program. And I know you probably don't want everything swept under trust-based philanthropy, but the MacArthur Fellows Program, in a way, I think is pretty trusting. So the way it works, for those who don't know, we give out between 20 and 25 awards a year. It's right now $625,000 that people can use over 5 years for any purpose. Nobody applies. Nobody's asked to do anything. There is no report. There is no reports, right, guys? We do not ask for anything. You don't even have to show up. You're welcome to show up at various things, but really, it is no strings attached. And the group of people who nominate are people from the world, and some of you in this room have been nominators. The peer reviewers are peers in the field, and the selectors who make those choices are a group of people, and I've been a selector for the Fellows Program, who decide on who those fellows will be. And I actually, as president, do less relative to the Fellows Program than when I was a selector. I sign the checks. And unless there's some really terrible thing that we find in a background on someone, sexual assault or something, like where we shouldn't write the check, right? We do what this group of people in the community do, and then we give the grant and trust them to do the work. I actually think that history of doing that kind of grant making over a period of time is consistent with that. A second example I would give, we do some of what you would probably call strategic philanthropy. if what that means is setting a goal and then putting a bunch of money to it and then trying to accomplish that goal. So climate would be an example of this. It is our largest right now dollar commitment per year. And it has two parts in its goal. One is scientific, so along with others, to try to keep the temperature rise going more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And second, to focus on equity within that. Who's at the table? Who's affected, right? And one of the things I think has been a shift, and this is a shift from the way we did things in the past, and I do think inspired by your work and others, is as we do that, particularly that equity work in conjunction with that scientifically driven work, is to think about who can we give grants to in this kind of partnership approach that is going to make it better and connected to communities. So an example would be a grant that we made a couple of years ago to the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. It was a couple $1 million. They were leading a network of organizations, communities of color in Chicago, working on environmental justice. We gave them the money, in our case, millions of dollars, and they are then deciding how it's getting spent. And I suspect we stay in touch with them, but it is not a tethered relationship. It's not a strategic in the sense of, did you get that thing done or that thing done? I think it's much more trust-based in the way that you'd represent. Last thing I would note, we've spent a lot of the last couple of years at MacArthur defining our values to go with that beautiful mission, just, verdant, and peaceful, that you probably know from NPR, if you listen to NPR at all. We have some really, really, really good programs and so forth, and I do think that that's important, but we now have our values, I think, really well stated, and I think that values work along with the grant-making practices, the grants management practices, the way we work with grantees in community, the way we work with partners in community. To my mind, all of that is trust-based philanthropy, I think, in the way that your 7-pager on this topic really makes really clear. And if you haven't read it, it's a great 7-pager.
No, thank you. And I agree, and I actually don't, this is a little secret, I don't care if people use the phrase trust-based philanthropy. What I care about is, are we supporting social movements to actually succeed? Like, for instance, in a strategic climate change scenario, are we actually supporting indigenous leaders and movements which have demonstrated over and over again all over the world how far ahead they are than maybe like the more mainstream US climate groups? So for me, like, the underlying piece is, my mission is not that everybody uses that phrase. I think my mission is that people fund in a way where the money is circulated from both the endowment side and the grant side, where community trusted vehicles. So I'll just tell a quick story. In Montana, there was a foundation called Headwaters Health Conversion Foundation, and they actually split the state up into 5, and they held forums with all of the nonprofits that were doing work on social determinants of health. And they just led a democratic process and let each of the regions choose which nonprofit was going to get their largest, longest funding. And people thought it's going to be like, VU might say, oh my God, it's going to be the Hunger Games. But it really wasn't. Actually, like 95% in each state, the same organization was chosen by their peer nonprofits. So I guess what I think is true of what your work you're describing is sort of this transference of both kind of power of decision making, design, and our accountability to that. Like, I think that's what being swept under, if that's what being swept under the trust-based rug means, that's great. If it just means like I gave 1 year of multi-year support, or I got rid of written reports, but I now require my grantees to have 10 hours of conversation with me and go to 15 coffees with me, like, that's not the translation that I'm hoping for. But absolutely, I want to ask you about 2 things in 2 minutes. I don't think there's a dichotomy between strategy and trust. I think it's who we trust and who helps inform our strategy. But would you speak to how you think about evaluation and impact under what you would think of as a trust-based umbrella?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain things we can evaluate really, really well and really easily, and others that we can't. So, do we evaluate the fellows program? We do in a general sense, but we certainly don't evaluate every fellowship that we put out there. And we believe that we make a ton of change. Like, I am so psyched that Ai-jen Poo is doing what she does. And it's not because she got the MacArthur Fellowship that she's doing this, but she's doing incredible things. Ta-Nehisi Coates, you think about Nicole Hannah-Jones, you think about, I could go down the list, but Lin-Manuel Miranda, like, it was before Hamilton, right, that he got the incredible MacArthur Award. So I think there's a pretty good track record of finding people early early in their careers or even later in their careers, but with tons of running room. And I have been criticized, as many have who do this kind of thing, particularly from sort of a Silicon Valley approach, saying this is the biggest waste of money in philanthropy and so forth to give the fellowship. I just disagree, right? Can I prove it? I don't know. I thought Hamilton was pretty good, but you know, I think there are a bunch of ways we could think about the things that have been done through that approach that don't lend themselves to specific metrics. There are other things where we do want to study that. So in the case of our work in criminal justice, we've set out to lower the daily average jail population in 50 communities and to reduce the racial and ethnic disparities in those communities. We've done really well in the first one. We haven't done well in the second one, right? I want to measure that and I want to work on it. And the fact is we're shifting more money to the racial and ethnic disparities work because we haven't done it as well. That's worth studying and knowing, and that's numeric, right? So I just think there are times when quantitative metrics make a ton of sense and adjust your work, and then there are times when you take a qualitative approach. It's like any social scientist would tell you, it's not all one method. So I think in philanthropy, there are other methods we can use, and we should.
Yeah, agree. I think we have 12 seconds left.
All right, use them well, Pia, use them well.
Well, I mean, we're going to be open for questions in a sec, but I think one of the myths we hoped to dispel with this fireside chat with no fire is that trust-based philanthropy can only be done in a small, localized, sort of small money, small dollars way. And I think there's a little bit of racism in that, because there's a sense that, too, that trust-based kinds of funding go to communities of color. And I think this idea that there's a tipping point, like where you can overfund a grassroots organization, is a myth that I would love to help dispel.
I think we should dispel it right away.
Yes.
Yep. Doesn't make sense.
And you're doing it at MacArthur. Okay, thank you for this little chatting. Now we're going to look to you. I forgot to ask you for questions. You were supposed to be writing questions down, but I didn't ask you. So we are happy to take written or verbal question.
If you have a question, you can stand up and speak loudly while I find the mic. Project.
I will say, John, that I've gotten to observe you for 30 minutes. And another aspect to me of trust-based philanthropy is there's culture, structures, leadership, and grant making. And when I observe leaders with their teams, one of the things that I notice when when I sort of intuitively sense that this is a collaborative leader is like a certain amount of deference to the people on your team. And I've already experienced that with you, and it doesn't feel performative in any way. And I think sometimes people ask me, how do you identify folks if you're not having them apply, right? Rigorous, long applications. And I think we in philanthropy don't want to admit that some of this is gut check, like some of this is intuition. And I, for one, am a feminist, I'm a divine feminist, and I believe in trust and intuition as part of, what I match with my reason and my heart. So, so intuitively, I think that you have demonstrated a little bit of what I see as trust-based leadership with your team just right in front of me, which is very collaborative, very humble, making jokes, and definitely deferring to them. So I appreciate that.
That is easy to do when it's Sandra and Gabby and Mindy and just an amazing team at MacArthur. They're fabulous.
Yay.
It's totally true. I think actually one of the interesting things about trust-based philanthropy, I think there's one of the other myths about it that I've heard, is all it is big, rich foundations led by white people giving money to communities of color to give it away, right? That is like you're just giving, and I actually don't think that's the right, might happen, and maybe sometimes that's good, but that's not, as you said, the whole story. And actually, I think in many respects, one thing that then denigrates is actually the talent of the staff of foundations. So I actually think part of trust-based philanthropy is entering into meaningful partnership between professional staff who are amazing, like the colleagues who are here at MacArthur, and in whom, yes, we need to trust and be devoted to trust them to be accountable to and do the work really well, right? And to figure out, okay, against this strategy, against this game plan, how do we enter into trusting relationships with different partners? That actually is a real skill, right? So this is not about abdicating the responsibility and just writing the check. It's actually about building a meaningful partnership based on these shared values. So I actually think that there's a tie, I think, there to what good trust-based philanthropy can look like. And I really do think that's from grants managers, and that's lawyers, and that's program officers, and it's people across the spectrum in terms of what they do.
Yep, and we can get rid of officers as a term. Yep.
Thank you, P. and John. Joe Scantlebury from the Living Cities. I'm curious if you all could speak to the challenges, or I don't even think of them as challenges because we've been doing it for a very long time, We talk about trust-based philanthropy as if it's a new thing, whereas there are giving circles and others who've been doing this kind of work at the community level for many, many years in different ways. No label, just we got needs, let's put the money together and give the money where it needs to be. I'm curious how this dovetails with the long-term commitments to unrestricted support, multi-year support, and how that's actually continuing to move forward. Because during the pandemic, we found the way. And increasingly what we see is folks sort of slipping back into old habits. How would you both counsel philanthropy to stay the course in acting trust, living trust, doing trust, rather than talking about it as well?
I'm going to take the first half of that question. I'm going to give you the second half.
Sure.
So we at Trust-Based Philanthropy don't think we made anything up. Our grantee and community and social movement partners said, try to find a peer influencing strategy, because I think on the stage a few hours ago, people were naming over and over again the rhetoric versus the action. So there's a lot of talk about doing the right thing, and then people are still not giving core long-term support, right? Still. And so what Trust-Based Philanthropy was meant to be useful for was a peer organizing strategy, like a donor organizing strategy, to move people into action, into the kind of action Michelle was already doing, right? So I just wanted to speak to that piece. We in no way think we wrote anything. I mean, read everything at Justice Funders. You know, we more were using the push from our grantees to try to find an influencing strategy and framework. But do you want to speak to how we get folks to stay the course?
But I would say you did more than that in the sense that you've made something make sense and be coherent and compelling, even where different people thought they were doing different versions of it for whatever period. And so I think there is power in those words and that action, to be sure. Joe, I think it's such a good question, and I think we all have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what did we do during the pandemic that we're going to continue, and where we figured it out then, and why would we possibly not? Like, why would we revert to a mean that was an inequitable mean, right? Why would you possibly do that? Things have not gotten better. I mean, I think in what community can we say things are better today than they were, a few years ago? I think almost none, despite lots of good efforts and lots of good work. So, I think we have to press on those things. Whether general operating and, multi-year support is sufficient, as Pia said, I think the answer is no. It is a good thing to do. I don't think it's all of trust-based philanthropy. I just think we should do more of it. I press our team. Every time I see a project grant, I say, could that be gen op, right? I just think that's that's my knee-jerk reaction, and sometimes there are reasons to do that. But MacArthur, we have been giving support to organizations like NPR as an example for decades and decades, and I think that kind of relationship is important. It has helped us to have a relationship with them, say, about racial justice in their coverage over a period of time that I think we can have by virtue of that long-term relationship. The only downside, and I will just note this as a reality, is that when you're in these long-term relationships, it is harder to make change, right? So I believe that we have been overfunding white communities and overfunding white-led organizations, and to the extent that we then want to make a broader, more diverse, more inclusive set of grantees, we have to break off or reduce our long-term support for other white-led organizations. So I definitely get people in my face saying, why are you cutting off this grant or reducing this grant? Aren't you all about long-term general operating support? The answer is we have to be willing to end some of those relationships to create new ones, right? So there's a combination of those things that we have to do.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this chat. We are making a transition because we are over time.
Over time by 2
We're
minutes.
over time.
Sorry.
You're going to stay there.
Okay.
I'm going to stand up. Just, to just signify a change has happened. So a change is happening now. Hello, everyone. I'm still Pia Infante. We are now going to transition into a panel. Are you excited? It's a panel, y'all. Have you ever seen one of these? I mean, I'm raring to go on this, but this was really fun, John. Thank you. So let me introduce the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Skoll Foundation, Marla Bowe. Oh, you get music, Marla. That's nice. You can stand up. Everyone can stand up. Let's stand up. Okay. And then also the Racial Justice Initiative Director for the Hewlett Foundation, Rosa Maria Castañeda. You also get music, Rosa. Welcome, Rosa and Marla, to the stage. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here on this very exciting panel with you. and to continue the conversation that John and I just kicked off. So thank you. Actually, turning to you, newbies on stage, would you please introduce yourselves by sharing one thing that the interwebs have not revealed yet about you until today?
Sure, I'm happy to. I feel like I should be prepared for this question now. I was here when it was asked earlier, and yet I'm drawing a blank. So I'm Marla Blow. I've been with the Skoll Foundation for about a year now. So I've got 1 year under my belt as president and COO. So thank you. Really excited to be a part of this. And you know, I think maybe the easiest thing that if you go deep enough online, I think you might be able to figure it out, but it's not right there up front, which is that my COVID hobby has been piano. And so I am a very bad jazz piano player right now. So how about that? Yeah.
That's amazing.
And I think for me, it's that welcome to my hometown. This is the city where I grew up in, and it feels like a wonderful homecoming to be here with all of you today.
Thank you. Thank you both for coming into this conversation. So this conversation is actually from rhetoric to action. I think we heard a lot of inspiration from the earlier panel, from the presidents, about where we can move into action. In particular on this panel, I think we're going to attempt to sort of make sense of both trust-based philanthropy as this kind of frame that people are using right now and the ongoing racial equity work that we all have been part of. I want to have a real talk moment and just tell you that I am still grieving. I am grieving and aggrieved about the events of the past few weeks. I understand that shootings happen in America all the time. I have a 3.5-year-old, so it just floors me to think that we continue to witness this harm being done to our children, whether it's from a mass shooting or whether it's just an everyday shooting in some city in America, and we continue to have to drop our children off at these institutions. So, you know, I feel a real urgency about this topic. I think in philanthropy there's a lot of talking, and I think part of what I hope we can get to is what is the doingness of each of our institutions, and what other more doingness could we promote? So let me go to you, Marla, and maybe any framing thoughts for us as we think about what is philanthropy's charge right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you touched on something that has very much hit a nerve with me as well, and that is the loss of safety of our children in school, the feeling of safety, our own sense of safety, and I absolutely reject the theory that this is just something we have to live with. That is flat out unacceptable. I simply cannot live with that. And I have an 11-year-old son who I dropped off and watched walk away from me and go into his school building the day after that happened, and thought about what it would feel like if he didn't come back, right? And that day, the sound of him coming back into the house, which should be the most mundane sound in this world, felt like I was on a Zoom call, and it just felt like a little gift, right? That in the back of my head, I heard him open the door and walk back in. And I think as a frame, right, thinking about rising to the occasion, right, recognizing the moment that we are in and the importance of being able to meet that moment, right? And that I sat down with him and talked about this a little bit because I could see how upset he was and how much this was bothering him and the kinds of questions it brought up for him. And I talked with him about what I do for a living, right? And that this is we live within a system, that in that system we make all kinds of choices and we have all kinds of policies. This is not an inevitability, right? This is a set of choices, and that we can make a different set of choices, and it is my job to enable the making of other choices. And whatever that looks like, whatever we can find in order to enable that, I have to feel empowered to stand, even if necessary, stand alone in this space in order to be able to lead the way. And so part of the role of philanthropy is to lead and to find leaders and empower those leaders to stand at the forefront and meet that moment when it presents itself. That's how I frame it. And then within each area, there's specific framing, but that's where I'd start.
Thank you. Rosa, what is the moment that we're in? How would you describe the moment that we're in? And how has philanthropy, in your eyes, evolved or not since the George Floyd protests?
Sure. Thank you, Marla, for capturing the sobering moment that we're in, and we're having this conversation, that the chilling effect of these things are on our minds, and they're not over. We're living still in crisis. I think in the last couple years, I want to start with the positive. There has been a significant leap forward in philanthropy. I think the sector we can acknowledge has a troubling history. It's a tale of two stories, one in where we're proudly advancing racial equity, and one where we're part of the problem. And I think there's no question that in response to the blatantly racist turning of our politics, the demonization of Latinos and inhumane policies of kids at the border, a pandemic which exacerbated issues for communities of color, and the Black uprising over a public lynching, promoted a self-reflection in philanthropy of what we should have been doing all along, and an overdue scrutiny of what is the sector doing with its wealth. A sector that benefited from the favoring of wealth by public policy and the favoring of whiteness, but had been largely insulated from those critiques. And as a whole, we did see swift action. We've been talking about this, throughout the conference, what that swift action is. But dare I say it, I think that the steps that we initially took were the easy part. And now I think we're at the hard part. I think we're at a part where we mistook the pledges or these new positions that we brought in as the work. We got credit for it, and we mistook it for, oh, we did good, that is the work. But the work of institutionalizing racial equity, which takes honesty and humility and interdependence, is where we are now. The work of surfacing the biases in our philanthropic norms, the work of assessing our programs. We put a lot of money on the table, but it actually doesn't even match the historic undercapitalization of racial justice and investment in communities of color. I think you made this point, John, too, of the work of ending programmatic things, programmatic approaches that are never going to get us there, that are just slightly minimizing suffering, that is charity work, but isn't really redistributing wealth and opportunity. And that includes the work of reducing funding to white-led and predominantly white institutions, which haven't produced the results that we need. And these are our friends. I cut my teeth at white institutions, but I think we need a rebalancing. And I think that these are the tensions of the moment, is beyond the one-off investments, what are the sustained investments and what are the institutional practices? And I think it's, I think that there's a sense of, now that it's getting hard, a little bit of racial equity fatigue. And I think, I'm a bit nervous for our sector right now. Is this just a blip? And so as I look at this audience of Hispanics in philanthropy and people of color in philanthropy? I think it is to keep, as Charisse said, instigating that change from the inside, and the community holding us accountable from the outside. And for those of us who are doing the work from the inside, to keep pushing and give ourselves the pep talk back at our private offices that we need to keep showing up.
Yep.
And keep speaking the truth.
Yep.
And so that's where I think it is. We're at a tenuous moment of we stepped up, but are we going to sustain and continue to step up in a way that matches the scale of the problem before us? And are we going to do it in the long-term way that meets the historical, length that it took to get us here?
Absolutely. That's so brilliantly put. Thank you. We can all go home now. But I do, so I wanted to just say mismatched. You use the phrase mismatched, and there is research out there from Pri and others that sort of show the mismatch between pledges and money, right? Pledges and action. And you also touched on something that I think I'd love to hear from all of you about, which is that we're hitting a moment of such intense multi-system, to me, failure in many different forms. Social, political, democracy, climate, like there's so many systems that are needed to be transformed long ago and that haven't caught up to the moment. And so you were talking, Rosa, I almost got this image of like we've had some momentum, right? We all felt it, maybe, some momentum. And I feel like, for me at least, these recent turn of events in this country make me feel like we're hitting a hill. So I'm curious, maybe John, Marla, then you, as people that are meant to maybe have some wisdom and some inspiration for folks out there, all out there in the interwebs world too, how do you move yourself and your teams? Like how do you be with yourself and your teams during this moment to both honor how exhausted, honestly, most of our teams are, and honor the long-term work ahead that Rosa described?
Well, such a hard question, but crucial for us to answer for ourselves, I think, as individuals, as family members, as community members, as people working in philanthropy. And I honor exactly what you said, which is, our teams are exhausted, our grantees are exhausted. We're coming through a period, whether it was, dealing with 2016 to 2020 in the Trump administration, which was a, unmitigated disaster in almost every way, from my perspective, through, any number of things that we've talked about today. This is a really tiring period for those of us who want progress of a different sort than that. I'm sorry to be political, but it just seems plain. And we have to power through this racial equity fatigue. There's no choice, right? We cannot go backwards. We cannot regress. I feel like we've made too little progress to begin with. And so, it is, I think, like anything else, that we need to find ways to bolster one another, support one another, to build the kinds of communities and partnerships that you were talking about earlier, Pia, through trust-based philanthropy. I think we can get strength from one another. I think there are plenty of, of examples of people finding ways to find joy in the partnership, as well as get new energy from it. You were a teacher, I was a teacher. You get, even when you're tired, you go back in the classroom and you get energy off your students, right? There are ways to do that, and I think as a sector we have to figure that out. And there's just not an option relative to the racial equity work, for sure. So let's figure it out.
Thank you, Marla.
Yeah, I think one of the big places that I keep coming back to is setting a number, setting a target, making some measurable decision about this is in itself a little bit of a shortcut. And what I mean by that is it doesn't change the system. Meaning, if you say we're going to make sure that 25% or 50% or whatever percent of whatever we do lands on communities of color or is led by people of color, what it means, what is implicit in that is we're going to continue doing what we're doing and just make sure that it lands someplace different, versus fundamentally looking at what we do and what have been the ways that people have been excluded from that. I'm not interested necessarily, although if it's the only thing I can get, I'll absolutely take it. but I'm not interested in 25%, right? And I'm not interested in somebody one day looking at me and say, hey, are we done now? We are not done, right? This is about changing fundamentally how this craft is practiced. That means changing who is actually the primary actor in this equation. That means having people like me in the seat making decisions about strategically where are we going, what are we doing with making the criteria for the decisions on where the capital goes, on who is empowered to act, how they choose to act, who can identify problems that are worthy of being tackled. There's not a question in my mind that I've seen this country decide to make whatever it wants happen actually happen. There's no question. So the theory that sort of this can't be done doesn't fly. Right? So it's sort of the will, and the will to actually engage the mechanism itself. So funding Hispanics in philanthropy is one of our grantees, is for us a function of changing the system. Right? I think a lot about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said when she was asked how many women should be on the Supreme Court, right? 9, right? This is not a number. There's not like, oh, we've got 2, now we're done, right? We got 4 now are we done, right? Like, we're not done. What we're doing is changing this system so that it includes and has room for, and there's plenty of opportunity for everyone, right? And for everyone to be a part of it. So I think part of the challenge and what I use to motivate myself, the metaphor I use is, if you're in say you're in a car and you're going on the highway at 55 miles an hour, you cannot sit in that car and take a hard right? You actually have to slow down in order to be able to turn. Maybe right is the wrong message. Maybe I should say left. Right? We're going to go left. And so as a leader in an organization, as a new leader in philanthropy, I think about what it means for us to be able to turn in a sustainable way. Right, that puts us on a fundamentally different course without kind of flipping the vehicle, right? I don't want sort of what I call organ rejection, right, where I get seen as like a foreign invasion and trying to change too much too fast. But that should not be seen as a lack of commitment, right, or a failure to appreciate the urgency of the moment. Not lost on me at all. I think it's really a question of building a new system requires some resetting and some holding to account. I think your point was very well said, that both internally and externally, making sure that when we change the staff, when we change who receives the money, when we change who our vendors are, when we change where our endowments are invested, that those things are all steps and part and parcel of making this system function differently. And in the end of that, I'm not going to be looking for, have we hit 25% or 50% or, again, whatever number, or 100 million. It's, is this system designed in such a way that it now perpetuates something different than what it has perpetuated in the past? That's what I would share about that.
Thank you, Marla. Rosa, I really appreciated earlier when you said you also wanted to start with some of the good, and you mentioned the word joy. And I saw something from a journalist that said, if we only as journalists show up during the crisis, then we're not building trust and we don't have long-term relationships in a community. And I think it's true for funders. If we only run into the room because of a shooting, that means we didn't have any relationships in the first place. So Rosa, I want to go to you to share what are the brightest spots that you see right now in terms of what we're doing well as a sector. You started off a little bit, and I know that there are some examples in the room too, but I also wanted to hear a little bit more from you about what, Marie Kondo it for us. Like, what's giving you joy about something going on either in your work at Hewlett or elsewhere in the sector?
I think a couple of things. One is the way that people of color in philanthropy are organizing from within. We're holding our institutions accountable for what's next. And there come management challenges with that, but you can't have a moment where we responded out of principle and virtue and then have a step back from that without having folks of color in philanthropy go, wait, I thought we were just getting started. we can't go back. So I think that taking up our positions with patience, but also not too much patience, and holding our institutional accountable from within. I also am encouraged by the institutions that have committed to do both and. To do, yes, we are going to embed across our work, but we're also going to build a new shop so that we are doing racial justice work, structural change work at the same time. We're looking at the 150 million in new money, but we're also looking at the 520 million that we didn't call racial equity funding,
Yep.
but we need to scrutinize as well to be working in tandem with that. I'm encouraged by the role of presidents at this time is extraordinarily important because I've seen presidents bring in folks of color in positions that represent management positions, that are placed in the president's office. And let me tell you, nothing solves the issue of fatigue faster than you're in a management position in a president's office. It goes a long way to represent you're speaking for the president of the institution. This is mission-centric work. It is not siloed from what we do. And so, and of course, I'm encouraged by movement holding us to account. I think that Black-led movements created an opening, narrative-wise, accountability-wise, that wasn't there before in philanthropy. So, and philanthropy is a field that, let's face it, we're not accountable to too much outside of ourselves, our boards. So I do believe that there is a new accountability and a shame around, are you going to step up to your words, to your lofty words? And those things, I think, can have a powerful effect to keep it going, keep it moving. So I'm sure I'll think of others, but I think that those of us speaking truth to power from the inside and the accountability from the outside could help sustain and leaders taking up new positions, new leaders taking up new positions that are empowered to do the work. I mean, so many times in philanthropy, there's a trickle of people of color who are really not empowered to do the work. But to have them in those roles and to be empowered to do the work, to represent, be bridges to community, those things I think are different. They're of a different nature right now. And if we could really, really leverage that, I think we could keep the pressure on.
That is inspiring. Thank you. Any other stories from either of you about just like a bright spot that's also keeping you motivated along with accountability?
Well, I do think this idea that Rosa has shared about a both-and strategy is essential. And I just was thinking about how in the heat of the moment after the George Floyd murder and the protests and the energy that I think we all appropriately had, making that special allocation was table stakes. Like, we had to do it, and it's good that we did. In MacArthur's case, we actually borrowed money to be able to give away more money and not give away the general operating grants we'd committed to before. So we gave out $125 million in grants that were, we did them in a quite different way. We had cross-functional teams from across the organization. I pledged that, I did actually use a number. I said more than 50% would for sure go to organizations that were leading this kind of work and were led by people of color. We showed that we could do 85 or 90%, which is what we did in that case, which I think was, so that was something that we could do in that moment. But what I do think the real work is, the sustaining work, is to say we're not quite as big as Hewlett, but for the other, $300 or $400 million a year in climate, in criminal justice reform, in nuclear, in other fields, are we really doing embedded, deep, thoughtful racial justice and ethnic justice work within that context. That, to my mind, is happening, but I think having that commitment, that's the longer term play that touches on values and all the kinds of things we've talked about today. And I think that does bring it back to trust-based philanthropy, right, in a sense, which is if you can commit not just to the special initiative, which I'm not saying we shouldn't do, we should do, but then look at in those special moments, how do you bring that back and affect all of the core work? I think that's the longer term play. And I do see that happening, to be clear, in a number of places.
Can I give an example?
Yeah.
Pia, you know, and I think I want to be cautious around this, but when I came to Hewlett first, and Hewlett was one of the foundations that did a lot of things right, long-term commitment, an immediate step up, positions at the president's office. One of the things I asked was, well, who's in relationship with the groups that we newly funded? You know, where are they? And it was a mystery. It was sort of, you know, there's 15 new groups that we funded around racial justice. There's another 10 or so dozen that we funded around the Asian hate crimes. And then I realized, well, who's their program officer? Oh, they don't really have a steady program officer. Have we brought them in to teach our institution what we may not know and what we could learn from them? No, there really hasn't been that. Right. So when you enter into relationship with these groups, bring them in. It's not, again, the press release is not the win. Them. It's good to spray money, but the press release is not the win. It's being in relationship with these groups and internalizing that knowledge, whether you agree with it or not, but bring them in.
And I think that's the difference
to the black
for
box
me.
Of philanthropy.
Yes, and I think that's the difference for me between like a Mackenzie Scott style of giving, which is great. Millions of dollars falling into institutions, there's nothing wrong with it. But to me, the difference between that, which donors have done for decades or generations, just written checks and not have any relationship. I think for me, like that relationship piece and that accountability piece is how I see the synergy between TBP, trust-based philanthropy, and racial equity work, is that it's not just about throwing dollars, it's about HIP, what was it? It's about hollering, instigating, and then using the power of our position, right, to teach at the levels that we are. I think there's too little talk about bringing in trustees who also represent communities and actually setting them up for success. But actually, I wanted to ask one last question of you, Marla, in particular, which is, I'd love to hear you distinguish, like, what do you see as systems change type of partnership or funding? Because I think there's lots of funding. And I know at school that there's a lot of studying of complexity and system change. So I'd like to hear just kind of how you would define that for us.
Yeah. You know, I do think Rosa hit on part of this, right? Which is much more about not just funding, but also connecting and championing the work itself. What that looks like for us is we do a lot of investing in the relationship. I think you hit the nail right on the head, that there is an internal champion, there is a relationship that gets built and lasts over well beyond the duration of the award itself. You are part of a community, and that connection, that motivation, right, that inspiration that comes with being in the presence of like-minded people who are solving some of the same problems in a different way or different problems in the same way, right, that there's ability to exchange and realize, you know what, there's another way of thinking about this. And that power of being able to connect and bring people together is the thing that ultimately can lead to sort of systems change. I'll give one short example of a grantee of ours now, an award winner, that it's called Map Biomas, and they are monitoring rainforest cover and rainforest trends by satellite. And that investment and that analysis and the building of the platform that enables that came about through a conversation between a technology and data play and a rainforest monitoring play when they were sitting and waiting for a session to start, right, at another conference. And that germ of an idea led to this kind of opportunity that neither one of them was thinking about individually, but they had those two capabilities and they brought them together and came up with this incredibly powerful opportunity to be able to drive a systems change because of the detailed and real-time capability of being able to monitor change, right, and prevent it and highlight it. And that's the demonstration of what it means to connect and then champion and maintain that relationship over long periods of time, partly informed by, again, bringing together leaders and people with a variety of skill sets to drive that, that spark.
I hear like a lot of cross-pollination and like a lot of diversified backgrounds in that, which is how I experienced Oxford and Skull. Thank you very much. We are pretty much at the end of our time, and if you have a question for any of these brilliant people, please write it down and we will accept them soon. But I guess my last question for you all is, you're speaking to, how many people are in here? 150 some odd folks, and then online, hi interwebs people. We understand there's maybe 600 of you, 500 of you, or, well, at least some of you have it on and you're like doing something else, but I get it. But we're speaking to a number of people, many of whom work in funding institutions, and I have been accused sometimes of being a little abstract in my suggestions on panels. So I would like us to maybe offer or invite something specific that is possibly doable right now or from the seats that people are in, that sort of lead towards the kind of system change, the kind of long-term, the long road to whatever you want to call it, trust-based philanthropy, solidarity, participatory grant making, but maybe just an invitation that we throw out there for folks to take a bite. Anyone can jump in.
So I'll start. I think one of the levers and one of the things that I bring to the work that I do is I've had a career outside of this sector. So I did not grow up inside of a foundation or a philanthropic institution per se. And I've looked at changing organizations, sectors from a variety of perspectives. And I guess the one that I would invite as many of you as possible to participate in is to look at who you are not just funding with your grant dollars and who you are meeting and engaging with, but also who you are securing as a vendor, right? So in many instances, right, we all talk about supply chain and we think, you know, like automotive glass or something, right? Like it's not as lofty as that, but it's sort of, you're using lawyers, you're using marketing firms, you're using technology vendors, really importantly, a lot of technology vendors. And there are opportunities in every single one of those decisions to create economic empowerment, right? That there's a wake behind everything that we do. We don't think of ourselves as commercial entities, right? We think of ourselves as philanthropic entities, but we have a commercial side, and that has opportunity for a business, maybe a small business owner, a business owner of color, to be a supplier to you on a project, or maybe that's a building to something even larger. But that's a way that even in very relatively contained space, you can make a difference, right? That is a really powerful opportunity. So we are all doing and making those kinds of choices, and that's one that on the margin, everyone in here can do and play a part in, and that can drive meaningful change.
Very concrete, thank you. Jump to you.
You have taken mine, Marla. We have a commitment to business diversity at MacArthur Foundation, which is exactly this, and I hope that we can dovetail with you at some point on that effort. I'm a big fan of John Rogers from Ariel Investments, who's been pushing this idea for a long time of business diversity, but I'll choose another one, which is I think everybody who's here is in conversation with or has the opportunity to be in conversation with someone that we have worked with, and to just ask the question, how can we do it better? So I do think that one way to think about trust-based philanthropy is being in the kind of relationship where, you know, if Gabby is talking to the grantee that she's working with closely, you know, whether or not we gave them $100 million or $1 million, she can always ask, what could we do better? That can also always filter back around to other colleagues, and those of us who are in the president's office, you know, we're not going to be, I should do that too, and do that too, but I think being able to listen to Gabby and Mindy and Sandra and to sort of gather that, I think we will be much stronger for that sort of constant feedback loop.
Absolutely, I heard that from Michelle earlier too. Rosa.
I agree with these, and I actually think we could be a lot more multi-sectoral and partnerships with government, partnerships with corporations, and business towards a shared agenda. But I can't not be on the stage as the only Latina and also not say that I think we have approached the racial justice work in some sense as a zero-sum game. I'm someone who fundamentally believes that Black liberation is the needle through which we all win our freedom. And so, our racial justice work must be rooted in anti-Blackness. At the same time, this is not a but, it's an and. It's not a zero-sum game. And Black and brown partnerships and coalitions must be understood as part of the solution. Not only because that's a lot of work that's actually happening on the ground and we're missing all of the insights from it. Multiracial solidarity coalitions we must invest in. And we are locked into one-dimensional narratives about race and ethnicity in this country that I think is a trap, that I think serves a white supremacist agenda, actually.
Yeah, agree.
And that I think isn't practical. So from many different lenses, I think that it's important for the sector to also understand and seed multiracial partnerships, particularly in the South, and invest in them for the long haul. I mean, I'm seeing them success in like the labor work. I'm seeing success in childcare work. I'm seeing success in the criminal justice system. These are some obvious areas, but we could also identify other areas. And a lot of the work in the South and Southwest and across the country, when you get closer to the ground, it is Black and brown work.
Yep.
And so I think we need to really also think about the broader tapestry of the country, because ultimately it's a game of math, and we need to be additive in how we do it and reduce these silos in philanthropy and in our programs where the Latino workers over there, the immigrant workers over here, the Black workers over here.
Yeah.
And that's just not the reality. It's not smart. It's not going to win us. It's not going to take us farther, faster. And so and of course, you know, we need to do our own work in the Latino community and other communities to be the best allies.
Yes.
In the work. So I want to say that that's also a part of the position that I see myself playing, is that's my frame for how I think about funding racial justice work. And I offer that to others as an idea, an experiment with that.
Thank you, Rosa. I believe we have 12 minutes and 38 seconds for questions. Oh, and we have some.
Stack of papers.
And
Look at that.
some papel that I need to wear glasses to read because I'm old. Okay. Interesting. Would any of us like to address the issue of white-led foundations speaking on behalf of people of color and not having people of color staff use their own voices? I mean, John, not to single you out, but with love. I don't think this is leveled at you, but it was just like kind of a greater
Could be,
issue.
that's fine, too.
Yeah, but anything you would want to say to that?
Go?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I was reading the next question. Go. My bad.
So it's a good question and an awkward question. So good in the sense that, I think we have a sector that has been in a fair amount of change. I think that there are great things associated with the diversification of the sector, which is a part of it. There are more people who look like me in my position than there should be still. I think there are places where that's not so. So Chicago would be an example where we have a really extraordinary, truly diverse set of leaders, and I think that is a positive thing. So I was delighted to be invited. Had someone not invited me and had invited another member of our staff, I would have been equally delighted. One thing we talk about a lot at MacArthur is democratization of voice. So I try not to accept all speaking invitations. I try to, if you look at the news releases we do or the perspective pieces we put out or otherwise, we try to highlight grantees, but we also try to highlight staff at all different types of roles within the organization. I partner with woman Kristen Mack, who runs our communications around that. I think there are times and places where I should speak as president. I'm extremely conscious of being a white male of privilege who is cisgender and married to a woman and has 2 kids. I'm super aware of that, and I try to use it where I can to be an effective ally. But am I always the right voice for MacArthur? Certainly not. I will always show up on these topics if I am welcome, but I also do not push my way into the room, and I think that we have to all figure out how to play the cards that we have. I do think still in the sector there is a place for white leaders. I think there's a place for white men. I think there's a place for cis white men of privilege and so forth. I think we just have to figure out how that is part of a sustainable, appropriate, diverse, inclusive, equitable arrangement.
Agree.
Yeah.
And
Can I add to that?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I just want to add that I think in order for the rest of this sector to be able to hear what we're saying, it is actually really important that your voice be a part of the change as well. And unfortunately, one of the things I'm really worried about actually is what we hear, right? What information is being distributed, disseminated, and what information is making its way to all of our ears, and then what people are taking away from it, right? I last week listened to Jamie Dimon, as CEO of JP Morgan Chase, trying to defend what he was talking about around ESG and which environmental, social, and governance commitments at JP Morgan Chase, and defend himself from being accused of being woke. Now, this was bewildering, right? Like to sort of listen to this entire exchange, but it is a really important voice, right? To have him in this conversation, whether or not I think he was doing a good job of woke and defend, like there was a lot of common problems there, but his participation and having other people that are going to listen to him differently than they're going to listen to me, actually hear him grapple with this and express his level of commitment to it matters a lot. I do not think it is appropriate for anyone to speak on someone else's behalf or somehow reduce somebody else's voice or cut somebody else out of a conversation. That's not what I mean. But I do think it is important that all of those voices, including yours and Jamie Dimon's, to have some space to be able to influence places that I am not going to be able to reach, unfortunately.
Yep. I'm hearing multiracial, multi-gender coalition work, Rosa, in these comments. And I will say, as someone who was the co-executive director with a cisgendered, white, feminist, beautiful human man, that I feel like his ability to demonstrate how he was giving up power, both in terms of structurally being named as a co-executive director. I was also named as a trustee. My salary was equivalent to his. My benefits package was equivalent. So all the HR side as well, matched the optics, basically. And so I wasn't like a woman of color who was sort of elevated to leadership while he remained basically the decider of all things. But just kind of opening that up and demonstrating how power can be shared, and the white guy didn't have to disappear off the face of the planet or wilt or not have a space or a role is I think also a powerful story. But actually that leads to the second question that we got, which was about gender. And someone noted that when we were contextualizing this moment, we did not mention the escalation in violence towards women. not that it wasn't in our minds, but there is, I mean, we're just in a moment right now of what's going on with the Supreme Court and kind of, guns being less regulated than uteruses. And so I think they are just wondering, how can philanthropy not only respond to the gender dimensions of this moment, but also build enduring pipelines of women of color-led movement work? I think we're just looking at you, Rosa, but you could,
Yeah.
whoever.
So, I think sort of, that is a really hard, long fought battle. And sadly, this is the jolt in many instances that we might need to sort of re-engage and supercharge a part of our society that maybe thought that some of this fight wasn't necessary, right? That I've heard a number of people prior to what's been happening with the regulation of our bodies talk about that they're not feminists. And so again, right, there's this language, right? What is actually meant by feminist, what is meant by ESG, what is meant by woke, right? Like all of this language that's been kind of thrown around as if this is something to shrink away from, and recognizing the importance of when you shrink away, you risk losing. Right? You risk having something taken away from you that you might not have even realized how important it is. I was talking about this with some of my family members, and also about sort of what are workplaces doing to support their female employees. And what I argued is that in many instances, right, if you are employed in the kinds of organizations that I happen to be having this conversation with, your rights have really not changed very much. But the important thing is about the rights of the collective, not about the sort of individual. And that is the thing that I fear has been lost and hopefully can be restarted. The recognition that this isn't about personal level of comfort, right? It is about rights broadly defined, about civic participation, about empowerment broadly defined. And focusing on that is, I hope, a path to being able to get that back on an even keel. But I'm sad that it's necessary, but excited to see the mobilization to re-engage on Roe versus Wade, on the rights of women as they've been eroded, on what is amounting to something of a backlash a little bit towards some of Me Too and some of the gains through Me Too. And there's a realization that actually requires constant effort, right? That is, again, it's never done. That is something that always has to be supported, fought for, and reinforced time and time again.
I will just say that I'm proud of the ways that Larry has unapologetically said we are a foundation that will reify our commitment to sexual and reproductive rights here and around the world. And I think an accurate analysis of this moment helps us see that these things are all connected. The move towards autocracy, the move towards minority rule, the dismantling of democracy, the work to diminish the value of the vote for people of color. All of this is connected. It is part of a minority rule agenda right when we are on the cusp of actually trying to realize a multiracial democracy. And so these issues need to be understood as part of the same agenda, and to us it is. So I hope that's what I would offer, and I hope it is to
thank
others.
you for continuing to offer the interconnectedness of all of these elements. I really appreciate it. And I'll let you get a drink of water. I feel like we only have a couple minutes left. Were there any other questions? Okay, I don't know if anyone's chatting. Yeah?
There's got to be. Come on.
Anyone have any other questions? Otherwise, oh, Alejandro? No.
Okay.
Okay. Yes? Is that someone walking up to ask us a question or just getting some water or a seat?
Going to his seat.
Oh, I'm so sorry to just like put a spotlight on you like that. But listen, one of the thoughts I have at the end of this is that there's no need to demoralize ourselves. I could listen to the three of you talk all day long. You're brilliant. I'm so glad that philanthropy has leadership like you in place. And I'm going to ask you to share like a very short answer to this, because I think it's helpful to go back to our origin story. Like what got us into philanthropy? I don't know that any of us was like, 10 years old and said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a funder, So just to kind of end on a note of like, what got you into this, and maybe that'll help give an insight into like how we can keep ourselves bolstered for what really, it looks like a tough road right now. So I'm going to start with you, John, and just go down the line.
Really quickly, my mom, I realized that when I was so excited to take this job at MacArthur Foundation, that when I was growing up at the dinner table, she would always talk about grants and all these things that could make a difference. She's a pediatrician and, cares a ton about public health. And I just realized that I would want my mom to be proud of me.
Oh, John.
That's what happens, right?
Okay, sorry. Marla.
That's a tough act to follow. I don't know if I can match that. I think what I would say is what I'm hopeful for is that we can have a well-functioning society. If we have we don't exist in a vacuum. All of us exist in a context, and if we can have a well-functioning society, there are a lot of things that work really well when that's the case. So part for me is really about establishing kind of just a well-functioning social structure overall.
Thank you.
Your question was what got us in?
What got you in? Yeah, why did you say yes to working in this strange field called philanthropy?
I think I'm an accidental philanthropist.
Yeah.
But what keeps me in, for now, is bringing my voice, my unique story to bear in places where I'm constantly realizing how unique it is at the table and seeing its value. So I don't mean to make that I don't say that from an ego lens, but from realizing my role in whatever sector I work in is to facilitate the transfer of power so that people of color can live lives with dignity. I don't care if I do that from government, nonprofit, philanthropy, whatever's next. But I think of my life, I'm a refugee that came on a boat from a little island. And that perspective, that lens, speaking from that voice, you can't leave that on the table. You can't leave that.
Absolutely.
You can't, if you bring that, it is a value, you can make a difference. And there's not that many of us. And there should be more of us. And the invisibility and people of color in philanthropy is inexcusable and pathetic. And I just want to open the door for more of us to be doing this work, and I will open as many doors while I'm in this privileged position as I can for all of us.
Beautiful. I can't think of a better way to end on that note. So thank you. May there be a bazillion more Rosas in positions of power all over our field. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the three of you, for this.